Earl Johnson's gnarled hands trembled as he clutched his worn gardening shears. The prestigious Green Dreams Landscaping Company buzzed with activity around him. But at 68, Earl felt invisible. He shuffled towards the back of the greenhouse, his weathered face etched with lines of worry. "Earl, where are you hiding, old man? Samantha Reeves?" Sharp voice cut through the air. Earl's shoulders tensed as he turned to face his boss, a sleek woman in her 40s with perfectly manicured nails and a permanent scowl. "I need you to prep the tools for the Goldstein estate," Samantha barked, her eyes never leaving her smartphone. "And try not to embarrass us this time. Mr. Goldstein is a millionaire, and we can't afford your outdated ideas ruining this contract." Earl nodded silently, biting back the retort that danced on his tongue. He'd been gardening longer than Samantha had been alive, but in her eyes, his experience was a liability, not an asset. As Earl gathered the tools, he overheard Samantha speaking to a group of young interns. "Remember, folks, in this business, it's all about the latest trends. Leave the old-school techniques to dinosaurs like Earl over there." Laughter rippled through the group, and Earl felt his cheeks burn with shame. He quickly finished loading the van and climbed into the passenger seat, grateful for the moment of solitude. The drive to the Goldstein estate was tense, with Samantha rattling off a list of do's and don'ts. "Mr. Goldstein wants a modern, minimalist garden. No room for your quaint little flower beds, Earl. Just clean lines and strategic greenery. Think you can handle that?" Earl nodded again, his eyes fixed on the sprawling mansion that loomed before them. As they pulled up to the gate, a portly man with a friendly smile approached. "Welcome to my humble abode," the man chuckled, extending his hand. "I'm Richard Goldstein. You must be the team from Green Dreams." Samantha practically leaped from the van, her most dazzling smile plastered on her face. "Mr. Goldstein, it's an honor. I'm Samantha Reeves, CEO of Green Dreams. We're thrilled to bring your vision to life." Richard nodded politely, then turned his attention to Earl, who was carefully unloading the tools. "And who might this gentleman be?" Before Earl could respond, Samantha cut in. "Oh, that's just Earl. He's part of our support staff. Now, let me walk you through our innovative design concepts." As Samantha led Richard away, Earl felt a familiar pang of disappointment. He began his work quietly, methodically preparing the soil for the new plantings. Hours passed, and the sun began to dip low on the horizon. Earl wiped the sweat from his brow, surveying his progress with satisfaction. It was then that something caught his eye. In a forgotten corner of the vast property, partially hidden by overgrown shrubs, a flash of color stood out against the green. Earl's heart quickened as he made his way over, pushing aside the foliage to reveal a sight that took his breath away. There, nestled in the shadows, was an orchid unlike any he'd ever seen. Its petals were a deep iridescent blue, with delicate streaks of gold that seemed to shimmer in the fading light. Earl's mind raced as he recognized the rarity of this find. This wasn't just any orchid. It was a species he'd only read about in his most treasured botanical texts. For a moment, Earl considered calling out to Samantha and Richard. Surely they'd want to know about this incredible discovery. But then he remembered the contempt in Samantha's voice, the way she dismissed him in front of the client. Would she even believe him? Or worse, would she take credit for the find herself? With a heavy heart, Earl made a decision. He carefully covered the orchid, ensuring it was hidden from view. He would keep this secret, nurture it in private, and see where it might lead. As he stood up, brushing the dirt from his knees, he heard Samantha's voice in the distance. "Earl, where are you? It's time to pack up. Try not to leave any of your outdated tools behind." Earl took one last look at the hidden treasure before making his way back to the van. For the first time in years, he felt a spark of excitement, a glimmer of hope. Little did he know this small discovery was about to change everything. As they drove away from the Goldstein estate, Samantha's voice droned on about the day's successes. Earl's mind, however, was elsewhere, focused on the extraordinary find he'd made and the possibilities it held. Earth to Earl. Samantha's sharp tone snapped him back to reality. "Did you hear a word I said?" Earl cleared his throat. "Sorry, Ms. Reeves. I was just thinking about Mr. Goldstein's garden." Samantha rolled her eyes. "Well, While you were daydreaming, I was securing our future. Mr. Goldstein was impressed with our vision. We'll be back next week to start the full renovation." As they pulled into the Green Dreams parking lot, Earl couldn't help but ask, "Ms. Reeves, did Mr. Goldstein mention any interest in rare plants?" Samantha laughed dismissively. "Rare plants? Earl, this is a modern minimalist design. We're not creating some old-fashioned botanical garden. Stick to what you know, which isn't much these days." Earl nodded silently, but inside his mind was racing with plans. He had a week to figure out how to cultivate his secret discovery. As he climbed out of the van, he heard Samantha's parting words. "And Earl, try not to look so lost next time. We can't afford to have clients thinking we employ senile gardeners." Earl watched her strut away, then turned his gaze to the greenhouse. He had work to do, and for once he was looking forward to it. Earl's fingers moved with practiced precision as he carefully transplanted the rare orchid into a small pot. The greenhouse was quiet, save for the gentle hum of the ventilation system and the occasional rustle of leaves. It was well past midnight, but Earl had snuck back to Green Dreams, determined to give his secret discovery the care it needed. "You're a beauty, aren't you?" Earl whispered to the plant, its iridescent blue petals seeming to glow in the moonlight filtering through the glass roof. He'd spent hours researching, confirming his suspicion that this was indeed a previously undiscovered species of orchid. As the week progressed, Earl divided his time between his regular duties and tending to his hidden treasure. He propagated several cuttings, each one thriving under his expert care. The excitement of nurturing something so rare and beautiful rejuvenated him, bringing a spring to his step that hadn't been there in years. On the day of their return to the Goldstein estate, Earl carefully packed his secret plants into a hidden compartment in the van. As they drove, Samantha prattled on about her grand vision for the garden. "Remember, Earl, clean lines and minimalism. No fussy flowers or overgrown shrubs. Mr. Goldstein wants a garden that screams modern luxury." Earl nodded, his mind elsewhere. As they pulled up to the mansion, Richard Goldstein greeted them with the same warm smile as before. "Welcome back," Richard beamed. "I'm excited to see your team in action." Samantha launched into her rehearsed spiel about their innovative designs, but Richard's attention seemed to wander. His eyes lit up when they landed on Earl. "Earl, isn't it?" Richard asked, stepping around Samantha. "I was hoping you could show me around the property. I'd love to get your thoughts on some of the existing plantings." Samantha's smile faltered. "Oh, Mr. Goldstein, I'm sure I can better explain our vision." "I'm sure you can, Ms. Reeves," Richard interrupted politely. "But I'd like to hear from Earl first, if you don't mind." As they walked the grounds, Earl found himself opening up to Richard. The older man listened intently, nodding as Earl pointed out various plants and shared tidbits about their care. "You know, Earl," Richard said thoughtfully, "I've always had a soft spot for rare plants, orchids especially. My late wife was quite the collector." Earl's heart raced. Could this be the opportunity he'd been waiting for? He glanced back at Samantha, who was trailing behind them, her face a mask of barely concealed irritation. "Mr. Goldstein," Earl began hesitantly, "I might have something that would interest you." Before he could continue, Samantha interjected. "Mr. Goldstein, while Earl's knowledge of common plants is quaint, I assure you our design team is much more equipped to handle your unique needs." Richard raised an eyebrow. "Is that so, Ms. Reeves? And what experience does your team have with rare orchids?" Samantha blinked, caught off guard. "Orchids? Well, we could certainly look into sourcing some if that's what you desire." "I see," Richard mused. He turned back to Earl. "You were saying, Earl." Earl took a deep breath. It was now or never. "Sir, if you'll allow me, I have something I'd like to show you. It's in the van." As they made their way back to the vehicle, Samantha hissed in Earl's ear. "What do you think you're doing? Don't you dare embarrass this company." Earl ignored her, his hand steady as he opened the hidden compartment. Richard's eyes widened as Earl carefully lifted out the pot containing the blue orchid. "My word," Richard breathed, leaning in for a closer look. "I've never seen anything like it. Earl, where did you find this?" "Here on your property, sir," Earl explained, his voice gaining confidence. In that overgrown corner by the old oak. I've been cultivating it and some cuttings over the past week. Richard's face lit up with excitement. This is extraordinary. Do you realize what this could mean? Samantha, seeing the change in Richard's demeanor, quickly tried to interject. Mr. Goldstein, I assure you, if Earl found this on your property, it belongs to you. We at Green Dreams would never— Ms. Reeves, Richard cut her off, his tone suddenly sharp. I'm not concerned about ownership. I'm marveling at the discovery itself and at Earl's expertise in cultivating it. He turned back to Earl, his eyes twinkling. Tell me, my friend, what else have you been hiding from the world? Earl felt a weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time in years, someone was truly seeing him, valuing his knowledge and experience. He began to share his ideas for integrating rare and beautiful plants into the existing landscape, creating a garden that was both modern and full of hidden wonders. As Earl spoke, he noticed a change come over Richard. The jovial, somewhat bumbling demeanor fell away, replaced by a keen intelligence and laser-like focus. Richard asked pointed questions about Earl's methods, his knowledge of rare species, and his ideas for conservation. Samantha, sensing she was losing control of the situation, attempted to steer the conversation back to the original plan. Gentlemen, while this is all very interesting, we should really focus on the agreed-upon design. Ms. Reeves, Richard interrupted, his voice firm. I think it's time we had a frank discussion about the direction of this project. He turned to Earl with a smile. But first, Earl, I believe you and I have much more to talk about. Would you join me for tea in the conservatory? As Richard led Earl away, leaving a sputtering Samantha behind, Earl couldn't help but feel that his life was about to change dramatically. Little did he know just how right he was. Inside the grand conservatory, Richard gestured for Earl to take a seat. Now then, he said, his eyes twinkling with a mixture of excitement and mischief, why don't you tell me more about this remarkable orchid of yours? Earl leaned forward, his passion evident in every word. Well, Mr. Goldstein, it all started when I noticed a flash of color in that forgotten corner of your garden. As Earl recounted his discovery, Richard listened intently, nodding and occasionally jotting notes in a small leather-bound book. The conservatory, filled with lush greenery and the soft burble of a small fountain, felt worlds away from the tension outside. Earl, Richard said, setting down his pen, I must confess something to you. I'm not just a wealthy homeowner with a passing interest in gardening. Earl's brow furrowed. Sir, Richard smiled, reaching into his pocket and producing a business card. My name is Dr. Richard Goldstein. I'm a botanist specializing in rare and endangered plant species. This estate? It's part of a long-term study I'm conducting on urban biodiversity. Earl's eyes widened as he took in the information. The card in his hand bore the logo of a prestigious botanical research institute. But why the secrecy? Earl asked, his mind reeling. Richard leaned back in his chair. I've found that people behave differently when they know they're being studied. I wanted to see how a top landscaping company would approach this property without the pressure of knowing a botanist was watching. He fixed Earl with a keen gaze. What I didn't expect was to find someone like you, Earl. Someone with not only a wealth of knowledge, but also the passion and integrity to nurture a rare find in secret, rather than exploiting it for personal gain. Earl felt a warmth spreading through his chest. For years he'd felt overlooked and undervalued. Now, sitting across from one of the top minds in his field, he felt seen. Dr. Goldstein, Earl began, then paused. I mean, Mr. Goldstein, I'm not sure what to call you now. Richard chuckled. Richard is fine, Earl. We're colleagues now, after all. Richard, Earl continued, that orchid, I've never seen anything like it in all my years of gardening. Do you think it could be a new species? Richard's eyes sparkled. I strongly suspect it might be, which brings me to my next point. He leaned forward, his voice low and excited. Earl, how would you like to be part of something big? Something that could change the face of urban horticulture as we know it? Before Earl could respond, a sharp knock at the conservatory door interrupted them. Samantha's voice called out, tight, with barely contained frustration. Mr. Goldstein, is everything all right? We really should discuss the project timeline." Richard sighed, shooting Earl an apologetic look. "I suppose we can't avoid this conversation any longer, shall we?" As they exited the conservatory, Samantha was waiting, her arms crossed and foot tapping impatiently. Her eyes narrowed as she saw Earl emerge behind Richard. "Mr. Goldstein," she began, her voice sickly sweet. "I hope Earl hasn't been boring you with his outdated ideas. Now, about our modernization plan?" "Ms. Reeves," Richard cut in, his tone suddenly crisp and businesslike, "I'm afraid there's been a change of plans. Your company's services will no longer be required." Samantha's jaw dropped. But we have a contract. Our design team has already—" The contract included a clause allowing for termination at the client's discretion, Richard reminded her. "I'm invoking that clause now." Samantha's face flushed red. "This is outrageous. Is this because of some weed Earl dug up? I assure you, if rare plants are what you want, Green Dreams can procure any species you desire." Richard's eyes hardened. "Ms. Reeves, your dismissive attitude towards both your employee's expertise and the significance of his discovery only confirms that I've made the right decision." He turned to Earl, his expression softening. "Earl, I'd like to offer you a position as lead horticulturist for my research project. Your experience and intuition are exactly what we need." Earl felt as if he were dreaming. I'd be honored, Richard. But what about my job at Green Dreams?" Samantha, who had been listening with increasing horror, suddenly found her voice. "You can't poach my employees. Earl, need I remind you of your contract?" Richard raised an eyebrow. "I'm sure we can come to an arrangement, Ms. Reeves. Perhaps a transfer fee to compensate for the loss of Earl's services?" Samantha's eyes gleamed with sudden avarice. "Well, I suppose we could discuss terms." "Excellent," Richard nodded. "My lawyers will be in touch. Now, if you'll excuse us, Earl and I have work to do." As Samantha stomped off towards her van, muttering about contracts and lawsuits, Richard turned to Earl with a grin. "Well, that's taken care of. Now, shall we get started on our real work?" Over the next few weeks, Earl's life transformed. The Goldstein estate became a hive of activity as Richard assembled a team of researchers and horticulturists. Earl found himself at the center of it all, his years of experience finally recognized and valued. The blue orchid, now carefully preserved in a state-of-the-art greenhouse, turned out to be just the tip of the iceberg. As Earl and the team explored the grounds more thoroughly, they discovered several other rare and potentially unknown plant species thriving in the urban environment. One particularly exciting find came on a warm Tuesday afternoon. Earl was examining a patch of seemingly ordinary clover when he noticed something odd about the leaf structure. "Richard," he called out, excitement evident in his voice. "You might want to take a look at this." Richard hurried over, magnifying glass in hand. As he bent to examine the plant, his eyes widened. "Earl, do you realize what you found? This could be a completely new variety of clover, one that's adapted specifically to urban conditions." As word of their discoveries spread through the botanical community, the Goldstein estate became a mecca for researchers and environmental scientists. Earl found himself giving tours to wide-eyed graduate students, sharing his knowledge and watching with pride as they soaked up every word. One day, as Earl was tending to a new batch of seedlings, he overheard a conversation that made him pause. "Dr. Goldstein," a young researcher was saying, "the network wants to know if you're ready to start filming the next episode of Hidden Heroes of Horticulture." Earl's brow furrowed. He knew Richard was famous in botanical circles, but he hadn't realized there was a TV show involved. Curious, he made his way towards Richard's office, arriving just in time to hear Richard's response. "Ah, yes, tell them we're almost ready. We just need to finalize one more detail." Richard looked up, noticing Earl in the doorway. A warm smile spread across his face. "Earl, perfect timing. There's something important I'd like to discuss with you." Earl stepped into the office, a mixture of curiosity and apprehension swirling in his gut. "What's this about a TV show, Richard?" Richard's eyes twinkled with excitement. "Earl, my friend, how would you like to help me change the way the world sees urban gardening?" Earl, still processing the idea of a botanical TV show, tilted his head quizzically. What did you have in mind? Richard leaned forward, his enthusiasm palpable. Earl, Hidden Heroes of Horticulture, is a documentary series I've been working on. It's all about showcasing the unsung innovators in our field, people who are making groundbreaking discoveries or preserving vital knowledge, often without recognition. Earl nodded slowly, beginning to understand. And you want to feature the work we're doing here? Not just the work, Earl, Richard said, his voice warm. I want to feature you. Earl's eyes widened in surprise. Me? But I'm just a gardener. Richard shook his head firmly. You're far more than just a gardener, Earl. Your expertise, your intuition, your dedication. These are exactly the qualities we need to highlight. You've made discoveries that could revolutionize urban gardening and conservation. The world needs to hear your story. Earl felt a mix of emotions wash over him. Pride, excitement, and a touch of anxiety. I don't know, Richard. I've never been one for the spotlight. Richard nodded understandingly. I know it's a big step, Earl, but think about the impact you could have. There are countless other hidden heroes out there, experienced gardeners and naturalists whose knowledge is being overlooked or undervalued. By sharing your story, you could inspire others to recognize and appreciate that expertise. Earl thought about his years at Green Dreams, about all the times his ideas had been dismissed or his experience downplayed. He thought about other older workers he knew, pushed aside in favor of younger, trendier approaches. Maybe this was a chance to change that narrative. All right, Earl said finally, a small smile tugging at his lips. I'll do it, but don't expect me to become some sort of TV star. Richard laughed heartily. No promises, my friend. Once the world sees what you can do, you might just become the next big thing in gardening. Over the next few weeks, the Goldstein estate was transformed into a bustling film set. Camera crews set up their equipment around the gardens, capturing Earl's daily routines and his interactions with the research team. At first, Earl felt awkward and self-conscious in front of the cameras, but Richard's gentle guidance and the crew's professionalism soon put him at ease. As filming progressed, Earl found himself opening up more, sharing stories from his decades of experience and demonstrating techniques he'd perfected over the years. He spoke about the importance of understanding local ecosystems, the subtle signs that indicate a plant's health, and the joy of nurturing something from seed to full bloom. One particularly memorable day, the crew was filming Earl as he tended to the blue orchid that had started it all. As he carefully pruned the plant, he began to speak, almost forgetting the cameras were there. You know, he said softly, every plant has a story to tell, if you know how to listen. This little one here, it's been through so much, growing in a forgotten corner, surviving against the odds. And now look at it, thriving, multiplying. It's a reminder that sometimes the most extraordinary things can be found in the most ordinary places. He looked up, his eyes meeting the camera lens. That's what I love about gardening. It teaches you to see the wonder in everything around you, to appreciate the resilience of nature, and to nurture that resilience wherever you can. Behind the camera, Richard beamed with pride. This was exactly what he'd hoped to capture. Earl's deep connection to the natural world and his ability to inspire others with his passion. As word of the documentary spread, Green Dreams found itself under increasing scrutiny. Former employees came forward with stories of age discrimination and undervalued expertise. Samantha Reeves, facing mounting pressure, was forced to step down as CEO. The company announced a major overhaul of its policies, pledging to better utilize the knowledge of its experienced staff. Meanwhile, Earl's life continued to transform. He received invitations to speak at horticultural conferences, consult on urban greening projects, and even write a book about his experiences. Despite the newfound attention, Earl remained grounded, always happiest when his hands were in the soil. One sunny afternoon, as Earl was giving a tour of the estate to a group of city planners, he noticed a familiar face in the crowd. It was Jake, a young intern he'd worked with at Green Dreams. The young man looked nervous, hanging back from the group. After the tour, Jake approached Earl hesitantly. Mr. Johnson, I owe you an apology. Earl tilted his head, curious. What for, son? Jake shuffled his feet. Back at Green Dreams, I was one of the interns who laughed when Ms. Reeves made those comments about you. I didn't understand then, but watching your work here, seeing all you've accomplished, I realize how wrong I was, how wrong we all were. Earl felt a warmth spread through his chest. He placed a gentle hand on Jake's shoulder. Thank you for saying that, Jake, but you don't need to apologize. We all have more to learn always. That's the beauty of what we do. Jake's eyes lit up. Do you think I could learn from you, Mr. Johnson? I want to understand gardening the way you do. Earl smiled broadly. I'd be happy to teach you, Jake, and please call me Earl. Now, why don't we start with these new seedlings over here? They have quite a story to tell. As Earl led Jake towards the greenhouse, Richard watched from a distance, a satisfied smile on his face. This was exactly what he'd hoped for when he started this project. Not just to make discoveries, but to bridge generations, to ensure that vital knowledge was passed on and appreciated. Later that evening, as the sun began to set over the estate, Earl and Richard sat on the porch, enjoying a well-deserved rest after a long day of filming and research. You know, Richard, Earl said, looking out over the thriving gardens. When I first started this journey, I never imagined it would lead to all this. It's like I'm living in a dream. Richard chuckled. A dream you've earned, my friend. Your knowledge, your passion, they're changing the way people think about urban gardening, and we're just getting started. Earl nodded, a glint of excitement in his eyes. So what's next for us? Richard leaned in, his voice low and excited. Well, I've been thinking. This estate has shown us how much biodiversity can thrive in an urban setting, but what if we could take it further? What if we could create a network of urban gardens across the city, all connected and supporting each other? Earl's mind began to race with possibilities. A city-wide ecosystem. It could revolutionize urban planning, improve air quality, support local wildlife. Exactly, Richard grinned. And who better to lead such a project than the man who started it all with a single rare orchid? As the two men began to excitedly discuss their new vision, the camera crew, who had been filming from a discreet distance, shared knowing looks. They knew they were capturing something special, not just a story of horticultural discovery, but a testament to the power of wisdom, perseverance, and the unexpected turns life can take. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the estate. Earl and Richard's voices drifted on the evening air, filled with enthusiasm and hope for the future. It was clear that for Earl Johnson, at 68 years old, life wasn't winding down. It was blossoming in ways he'd never imagined. As the Hidden Heroes of Horticulture documentary series aired, Earl Johnson became an unexpected sensation. His gentle demeanor, vast knowledge, and inspiring story resonated with viewers across the country. Fan mail poured in, with people of all ages expressing how Earl had inspired them to look at urban spaces and gardening in a new light. One morning, as Earl tended to a new batch of experimental plants, Richard burst into the greenhouse, waving a newspaper. "Earl, have you seen this?" he exclaimed, his eyes twinkling with excitement. Earl set down his watering can and peered at the headline. Urban Gardening Revolution, Cities Nationwide Adopt Earl Johnson Initiative for Green Spaces. What in the world? Earl murmured, adjusting his reading glasses. Richard grinned broadly. It's happening, Earl. That idea we discussed about creating a network of urban gardens, cities are picking it up. They're calling it the Earl Johnson Initiative. Earl felt a mix of pride and disbelief wash over him. It was just an idea we tossed around. Ideas have power, my friend, Richard said, clapping Earl on the shoulder. Especially when they come from someone with your expertise and passion. People are listening, Earl. They're ready for change. Over the next few months, Earl found himself at the center of a growing movement. City planners and environmental groups reached out for advice on implementing urban gardening networks. Schools requested workshops on integrating gardening into their curricula. Even corporations, eager to improve their environmental image, sought consultations on creating green spaces in their office complexes. Despite the whirlwind of activity, Earl remained grounded, always happiest when he was working directly with plants and teaching others. He took particular joy in mentoring young gardeners, including Jake, who had become a regular presence at the Goldstein estate. One day, as Earl was demonstrating pruning techniques to a group of community college students, he noticed a familiar face hovering at the edge of the group. It was Samantha Reeves, his former boss at Green Dreams. She looked different, humbler somehow, without her usual air of superiority. After the lesson, Samantha approached Earl hesitantly. "Mr. Johnson, Earl, I wonder if I might have a word?" Earl nodded, curious. "Of course, Samantha. What can I do for you?" Samantha took a deep breath. "I owe you an apology, Earl. The way I treated you at Green Dreams, it was inexcusable. I was so focused on trends and profits that I failed to see the value of true expertise and experience." Earl's expression softened. "Thank you, Samantha. I appreciate you saying that. I've been doing a lot of thinking since I left Green Dreams," Samantha continued. "I realized I went into landscaping because I loved plants, but somewhere along the way I lost sight of that. Watching your work, seeing the impact you're having, it's inspired me to reconnect with why I started in this field in the first place." Earl smiled warmly. "It's never too late to rediscover your passion, Samantha." Samantha nodded, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "That's actually why I'm here. I was wondering, do you think I could volunteer here? Learn from you? I want to be part of this movement you've started to really understand sustainable urban gardening." Earl felt a surge of satisfaction. This was why he did what he did, not for recognition, but to inspire others to connect with nature. "We'd be happy to have you, Samantha. Why don't you join us tomorrow? We're starting a new project on vertical gardening for small urban spaces." As Samantha left, visibly relieved and excited, Richard approached Earl. Well, he chuckled. "The student becomes the teacher. How does it feel, Earl?" Earl shook his head, smiling. "It feels right, Richard. Like everything's coming full circle." Richard nodded thoughtfully. "You know, Earl, we've been so focused on the local impact of our work. But I've been thinking, what if we could take this global?" Earl raised an eyebrow. "Global? What did you have in mind?" Richard's eyes sparkled with enthusiasm. "I've been in talks with some international environmental organizations. They're interested in adapting our urban gardening model for cities around the world. Imagine it, Earl. From New York to New Delhi, Tokyo to Timbuktu, green networks bringing nature back into urban spaces." Earl felt a thrill of excitement. "It's a beautiful vision, Richard. But how would we even begin to implement something like that?" Richard grinned. "Well, that's where you come in, my friend. How would you feel about taking our show on the road? Traveling to different cities, working with local experts to adapt our methods to their unique environments?" Earl's mind raced with possibilities. He thought about all the different climates, the variety of plants he could work with, the new challenges each city would present. It was daunting, but also thrilling. "You know, Richard," Earl said slowly, a smile spreading across his face, "I think I'd like that very much." Over the next year, Earl found himself embarking on a journey he never could have imagined. From the rooftop gardens of Singapore to the community allotments of London, he worked with local gardeners and environmentalists to create green oases in urban jungles. In Mumbai, he helped develop a system of vertical gardens that not only beautified the city, but also helped combat air pollution. In Cairo, he worked on drought-resistant urban farming techniques that could help feed communities in water-scarce regions. In Rio de Janeiro, he collaborated with locals to transform neglected favela spaces into thriving community gardens. Throughout his travels, Earl never lost his sense of wonder at the resilience of nature and the power of community. He saw how gardens could bring people together, breaking down social barriers and fostering a sense of shared purpose. One particularly memorable moment came in a small town in Kenya. Earl was working with a group of local women to establish a sustainable vegetable garden in an area plagued by drought. As they planted the first seedlings, using innovative water-conserving techniques, one of the women turned to Earl with tears in her eyes. "Mr. Johnson," she said, her voice filled with emotion, You've given us more than just a garden. You've given us hope." Earl felt his own eyes welling up. "No, my dear," he replied softly. "You've had the strength and knowledge all along. I just helped you see it." As Earl's international work gained attention, he found himself speaking at global conferences, advising governments on green urban planning, and even meeting with world leaders to discuss environmental policy. Yet, through it all, he remained the same humble gardener at heart, always happiest with his hands in the soil. One evening, as Earl sat in his hotel room in Tokyo preparing for a presentation the next day, his phone rang. It was Richard. "Earl, my friend." Richard's voice boomed through the speaker. "How's the world treating you?" Earl chuckled. "It's been quite a journey, Richard. Sometimes I can hardly believe this is my life now." "Well, believe it," Richard said warmly. "You've earned every bit of it. But listen, I've got some news. Remember that rare blue orchid that started it all?" Earl sat up straighter. "Of course. What about it?" "Well," Richard said, excitement evident in his voice, "our research team has finally completed the genetic analysis. Earl, it's not just a new species. It's a whole new genus. They want to name it after you, Johnsonina caerulea." Earl felt a wave of emotion wash over him. From a forgotten corner of a garden to a new entry in the botanical books. It was almost too much to take in. I don't know what to say, Richard," Earl stammered. "You don't have to say anything, my friend," Richard replied softly. "Your work speaks for itself. You've changed the world, Earl. One garden at a time." As Earl ended the call, he walked to the window of his hotel room. The Tokyo skyline stretched out before him, a sea of lights and concrete. But now, he could see the potential in every rooftop, every tiny balcony, every crack in the pavement. Each one a possible home for a bit of green, a splash of life in the urban landscape. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, from an overlooked gardener to a global environmental leader. It hadn't always been easy, but every challenge had been worth it. As he turned back to his presentation notes, Earl felt a renewed sense of purpose. There was still so much work to do, so many lives to touch, so many urban spaces to transform, and he was ready for all of it. Earl Johnson, the once ridiculed old gardener, had found his true calling, and at 69 years old, he knew that his greatest adventures were still to come. As Earl's global mission continued to flourish, he found himself back in his hometown for a special event. The city was unveiling its first major project inspired by the Earl Johnson Initiative, a sprawling network of interconnected green spaces that wound through the urban landscape like a verdant ribbon. Standing on a makeshift stage in what was once an abandoned lot, now transformed into a thriving community garden, Earl gazed out at the sea of faces before him, young and old, from all walks of life. They had gathered to celebrate this transformation of their city. Mayor Lisa Chen stepped up to the microphone, her face beaming with pride. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are here today to honor a man who has taught us all to see the extraordinary in the ordinary, to find hope in a handful of soil. Please join me in welcoming our own Earl Johnson." As applause erupted, Earl made his way to the podium, his weathered hands gripping the edges as he looked out at the crowd. He saw familiar faces, Richard beaming proudly from the front row, Jake, now a confident young horticulturist in his own right, Samantha, who had become one of the initiative's most passionate advocates. And there were new faces too, people whose lives had been touched by the green revolution he had inadvertently started. "Thank you all for being here today," Earl began, his voice strong despite his years. "You know, when I first started gardening, I never imagined I'd be standing here talking to all of you. I was just a man who loved plants, who found peace in nurturing growing things." He paused, looking out over the lush greenery that now dotted the cityscape. "But what I've learned over these past few years is that gardening is about so much more than just plants. It's about community. It's about hope. It's about seeing the potential for beauty and life in the most unlikely places." As Earl spoke, he could see heads nodding, smiles spreading across faces. He continued, his passion evident in every word. "Each one of us has the power to make a difference, to nurture life, to transform our world. It doesn't matter if you have a vast estate or just a tiny windowsill. Every seed planted, every leaf tended, is an act of hope, a step towards a greener, more vibrant future. He gestured to the flourishing garden around them. Look at what we've accomplished together. This garden, like so many others across our city and around the world, isn't just my legacy, it's yours. It belongs to all of us who believe in the power of growth, of renewal, of life finding a way, even in the heart of our concrete jungles. As Earl's speech concluded, the applause was thunderous. People rose to their feet, cheering and wiping away tears. Mayor Chen returned to the microphone, her voice thick with emotion. In honor of Earl's contributions to our city and to the world, we are officially renaming this network of green spaces the Earl Johnson Greenway. May it stand as a lasting testament to the power of one person's vision to change the world. The crowd erupted once more as a large banner was unfurled, revealing the new name. Earl felt overwhelmed, humbled by the outpouring of love and appreciation. As the formal ceremony concluded, people began to mingle, exploring the garden and sharing their own stories of how the initiative had impacted their lives. Earl found himself surrounded by well-wishers, each eager to share a word of thanks or a personal anecdote. Amidst the crowd, a small girl tugged at Earl's sleeve. He knelt down to her level, smiling warmly. "Hello there. What's your name?" "I'm Lily," the girl said shyly. "Mr. Johnson, I started my own little garden because of you. It's just in a shoebox on my window, but I grew a tomato." Earl's heart swelled with joy. "That's wonderful, Lily. You know, every great garden starts with just one plant. You keep tending to your shoebox garden, and who knows, maybe someday you'll be standing up here, telling everyone about the forest you've grown." As Lily beamed and scampered off to tell her parents about her conversation with the famous Earl Johnson, Richard approached, a mischievous glint in his eye. "Well, my friend," Richard said, clapping Earl on the shoulder, "how does it feel to be a living legend?" Earl chuckled, shaking his head. "Oh, stop it, Richard. I'm just a gardener who got lucky." Richard's expression turned serious. "No, Earl, you're so much more than that. You're a symbol of what can happen when we value wisdom, when we listen to those with experience, when we give people the chance to share their gifts regardless of their age." Earl nodded thoughtfully. "I suppose you're right. And if my story can inspire others to pursue their passions, to keep learning and growing no matter their age, then I'm grateful for that." As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the garden, Earl found a quiet moment to himself. He walked through the paths he had helped design, touching the leaves of plants he had nurtured from seedlings. Each one held a memory, a lesson, a piece of the incredible journey that had brought him here. He thought about the twists and turns his life had taken, from a disrespected older worker to a global environmental leader, from tending a forgotten corner of a millionaire's estate to advising world leaders on urban sustainability. It was almost too much to comprehend. Yet, as he stood there in the fading light, Earl realized that at his core, he was still the same man he had always been. A man who found joy in the feel of soil between his fingers, who saw beauty in the unfurling of a new leaf, who believed in the transformative power of nurturing growing things. As he made his way back to the gathering, Earl overheard snippets of conversation that made him smile. People discussing their plans for rooftop gardens, debating the best plants for air purification, sharing tips on composting in small spaces. The seeds of knowledge he had planted were taking root, growing into a movement that was changing the face of cities around the world. Samantha approached him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Earl, I don't know if I ever properly thanked you. You didn't just teach me about gardening. You taught me about forgiveness, about second chances. I'm a better person because of you." Earl embraced her warmly. "We all have our roles to play, Samantha. I'm just glad you found your way back to your love of plants." As the evening wound down, Mayor Chen announced one final surprise. In addition to the Earl Johnson Greenway, we are establishing the Earl Johnson Scholarship for Urban Horticulture. This will ensure that Earl's legacy continues, inspiring and educating future generations of gardeners and environmental leaders. The crowd cheered once more, and Earl felt a sense of completion. His knowledge, his passion, would live on long after he was gone, nurturing not just plants but people, communities, entire cities. As the stars began to twinkle overhead, Earl found himself back on the stage, looking out over the garden that bore his name. Richard stood beside him, both men content in the comfortable silence of old friends. "You know, Richard," Earl said softly, "when I found that little blue orchid, I never imagined it would lead to all this. It just goes to show, you never know which seed will grow into something magnificent." Richard nodded, smiling. "That's the beauty of what we do, Earl. Every day is a new opportunity to plant something wonderful." As they stood there, the gentle breeze carrying the scent of blooming flowers, Earl felt a profound sense of peace. He had lived a life beyond his wildest dreams, touched countless lives, and helped bring nature back to the concrete jungles of the world. But more than that, he had stayed true to himself. Through all the accolades and adventures, he had remained Earl Johnson, the man who found joy in helping things grow. As the last of the guests departed, Earl took one final walk through the garden. In a quiet corner, he knelt down and gently planted a small seedling, a cutting from that first rare blue orchid that had started it all. "Here's to new beginnings," he whispered to the tiny plant, "and to all the wonderful things yet to grow." With that, Earl Johnson, the once ridiculed old gardener, turned global environmental hero, turned and walked out of the garden. But he knew he'd be back tomorrow, and the day after that, and for as many days as he had left. For there were always more seeds to plant, more lives to touch, more beauty to nurture in this great green world. And so, as the moon rose high over the Earl Johnson Greenway, the story of one man's extraordinary journey came full circle. But in many ways, it was just the beginning. For in gardens across the city and in cities around the world, countless new stories were taking root, ready to bloom in their own magnificent ways.